Welcome everyone to another ACO Saturday morning. I'm with Carlos and Sarah and Mariana, and just want to talk a little bit about what the ACO does. We are a every other Saturday morning artist interview kind of program. We are in part funded by this Maryland State Arts Council, so thank you to them, and also viewers who periodically throw in donations to us. Today I want to kind of talk a little bit about Carlos. Carlos, he is a videographer who was doing some work at Glen Echo Park. That's how I kind of ran into him. And Carlos is actually one of the people I'd say knows more artists than anyone else. And he knows artists from a lot of varieties of backgrounds and styles and mediums. So I got to asking Carlos, do you have anyone to recommend for this program? And he said, oh, do I ever? And Sarah came up as, Sarah Jamison came up as one of the artists who Carlos really raved about and said it would be absolutely perfect for the program. So I want to introduce Carlos before he introduces Sarah. So thanks, Carlos, for bringing Sarah to our table.
Thank you for giving her a place to talk about what she does. It's absolutely amazing. So can everybody hear me? I've been told I had audio. Okay, great. So I'm just going to jump right into it. Thanks for everyone for being patient with me. This is my first time introducing somebody. So here we go. Hello all. Thank you for joining this morning for the online artist discussion with Sarah Jamison. As Jordan said, my name is Carlos Gonzalez-Fernandez, and I produce a series called People Things. The series profiles creative people while they're doing their creative work in their creative spaces. Very simple premise, but I just wanted to keep it really simple. With the series, I wanted to capture creatives during those many long hours that they spend focusing on their projects alone, by themselves, just at their desks and tables or whatever they're working on. I wanted to show these portions of the creative process that are usually only known to the creatives themselves. I wanted to share that with just more people. A couple of years ago, I was on Instagram just scrolling as one does, and the algorithm presented me with a post that at first I was going to dismiss, thinking it was photoshopped or like CGI type of image, cool, but not hard for a machine to make. But luckily I kept reading the caption and discovered that what I was looking at was actually meticulously crafted colored pencils and ink, all done. And I really couldn't believe it. I probably zoomed in on my phone like tons and tons and tons of times just to see if what I was seeing was real. And I know a lot of great artists, as Jordan had mentioned, but this was like amazing to me. I went right to her profile and was overwhelmed by all the work that I saw. And there were also videos there to verify that the work was real. This was computer generated. 5 minutes of looking at the images before I reached out to her to see if I could profile her for my series. I had to see this work happen with my own eyes right in front of me. And luckily, Sarah was super cool and agreed to be part of the series. So I'm going to give you a little bit of her background. This is the boring intro stuff, but it'll be quick. Sarah is a graduate of the Corcoran College of Art and Design. She has won numerous awards, including the Washington City Paper's Best Visual Artist Award, well-deserved. She received credit, has given lectures on cool topics, has tons and tons of shows, and yada, 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 yada. Just all the standard stuff that an incredible artist accumulates just by doing the work and being true to what they do. Jordan, however, asked me to focus on why I think her work is cool and what draws me to Sarah's work. And so I was thinking about that, and I came up with 3 primary reasons. The first thing is that I feel that Sarah is a true artist and technician. Spending the many hours that I did filming her while she was working, I was witnessing someone who never cheats the process, someone who enjoys partaking in the inordinate amount of work needed to create the details and textures that make the work appear as if it were a photograph. The obvious dedication to and joy of the discipline that Sarah had amazed me. Second, Sarah's work protocol I find magical. Filming, I saw her create concepts in her head, flesh them out in Photoshop, and then spend a tremendous amount of time recreating those computer-generated ideas with colored pencils. It was, well, this will get into the next thing I'm about to say. it was just amazing to see how much dedication she had to recreating these images that she thought. And I was truly fascinated by the contrast of someone spending so much time to painstakingly recreate graphics which were created on a computer. I mean, created by a human, but through the computer creating these compositions. He makes them very fast in Photoshop, but spends so much time making them exist in the real world with real materials. Third, the concepts underlying the amazing artwork are just as beautiful as the artwork itself. Often I find myself immediately moved by the juxtaposition of human communication mixed with isolation that, to my mind, her work just floods me with these ideas and visuals. It's often like a lonely affair, but very, very beautiful. And lastly, Sarah is just an awesome person who is very generous in letting a stranger in her studio while she was working. I hope I didn't bother you too much, Sarah.
Not at all.
And with that, I want to hand over control to the extremely talented Sarah Jamison.
Thank you, Carlos. That was a beautiful intro. Carlos and I, was it 2021 that you came and did all the filming? So that was cool. You speak very eloquently about my work, probably because we did spend so much time together, but thank you guys. Thank you all. And anyone watching today, I really appreciate it. And I guess I'll start just kind of chatting at you before I make you look at like my 4-page PowerPoint. But as we've already said, my name's Sarah Jamison, and I'm a Washington, D.C. based artist. I graduated from the Corcoran College of Art and Design in 2010. So I've been in D.C. creeping up on 20 years making my artwork. And I'd say by the time I was halfway through college, I was working already primarily with colored pencils. So that has been an evolving process for me since then. And it, as I said, is primarily colored pencil, but I do often combine with other media. I have, it's like all on the desk around me, but paint pens. I'll use a bit of acrylic gouache, which is it's kind of like the Hannah Montana best of both worlds, acrylic and gouache. So it can be quite flexible and opaque, or it can be very thin and translucent. So I use that quite a bit in my work, and ink as well. And I'll just talk a bit about kind of the medium that I use. And Carlos, you kind of very eloquently addressed tedium. It's like a very lovely tedium for me, but sort of why I feel so attracted to the process that I do. And then I'll delve into kind of imagery and concepts and things like that. But for me, colored pencil is something that I love because it's very high control. That's something that appeals to me quite a bit. It's a little bit unforgiving because when you put those marks down, you can't really go over them. You can't take them up. So in a lot of ways, it feels quite high stakes and high control. So for me, there's always that push and pull of trying to find mastery in a medium that can be fairly inflexible. But there are ways to use them so that it feels like paint. It layers like paint. But I think it's much more accessible. For me, there's not really a lot of setup or takedown. If I choose to watch wrestling and I want to keep working on my piece, which happens frequently, or if there's like a pay-per-view on Sunday, I can take my work downstairs. There's not like a ton of setup. There's not like oil paints hanging out wet for weeks or whatever. And there's also that sort of inquantifiable question of like, you know, why choose art? Why choose colored pencils? Why choose whatever medium that you're working in? And for me, it's really like there is no conscious choice. Being an artist is something that I've always felt called to pursue. It's something that I find like completely bound in my identity as a person, to say nothing of like as my career. And colored pencil is just the thing that once I started with it, it just felt warm and correct in my hand. And I apologize, that's a FaceTime from my niece. I have a 6-year-old, 3-year-old, and then a brand new baby boy nephew, and they love to FaceTime. But so for me, that's something that it's almost not an active choice for me. It feels so intuitive that there's no other way for me to create. I feel dissatisfied when I'm working with other mediums, or if I try to push outside, another question that I feel like, we'll say artists broadly get asked a lot is maybe like, why realism? Why, and maybe you hear it more in art school, maybe you don't, I don't know, but it's sort of like, well, if you're just going to render something, to the point of a photograph, why not make it a photograph? And I think that that's like a pretty interesting and valid question, but it's also like, it's hard to quantify into words, but it's like, I don't want to take photographs. I don't like to take photographs. If I try to unwind with abstract art, I look at it and I think it's terrible and I don't like it and I want to throw it out. It's not something where I'm doing it in a way that's sort of a chosen path. It's something that, and I'm sure other artists feel the same way, whether you're a guitarist or a painter or whatever, but you're doing what you're doing because you have to do it. And so for me, those other mediums that I use to supplement colored pencil are a way for me to sort of push the boundaries. Sometimes there's techniques or maybe a density of color that colored pencils cannot always capture. So that's when I bring in other materials. But for me, that the colored pencil is the way that I have to work, and it's the way that I do work. So that kind of prefaces why I work the way I do with the materials I do. And for me, sort of colored pencils, in addition to being very high control, take quite a long time to work with. I sit with these ideas for a long time. I want to pour into the work that I make sort of a meditative process, something where I'm fully invested, and this is a reflection of my concepts, my being, my concerns, my interest in why I feel like it's important to make artwork. So for both of those reasons, I'm working the way that I do. And again, you touched so many great bases, Carlos. I'm so appreciative of you. But you talked even about the process of how I compose those images. So I'll kind of move into like that and inspiration, and then we'll get into the nitty-gritty of a few of my most recent works. But for me, and maybe like kind of high control or type A personality or OCD, I don't know what it is, but for me, I really find fascinating and highly respect artists for whom the creative process for them is sitting down and just seeing what comes out. But to my mind, that's extremely anxiety inducing. I don't want, it takes a long time for me to create things. And I don't want any mystery about what it's going to look like, what I am trying to say. So my process begins digitally, where I'm always collecting images off the internet. I try to adhere to finding images that are on royalty-free sites, manipulating them. Sometimes I'll use images, or maybe images is the wrong word, but maybe like art pieces. Like I've used some of the like the famous one, the Judith and Holofernes. I don't know if I'm saying that right, but the one by Artemisia Gentileschi, where the head's getting cut off by Judith and Holofernes. Or perhaps like the Met has an amazing royalty-free collection you can delve into. And sometimes I'm just in there typing in words like terracotta or evil and seeing what pops up. Sometimes it's just perusing through these things, looking for something that catches my eye, or perhaps I have a concept in mind of what I'm looking for. And so once I'm ready to create a piece, I'm going into Photoshop and I'm collaging these images and I'm manipulating them and maybe editing them. And sometimes it's quite experimental to where I just want to pull together things I think look nice. I don't necessarily have a direction in mind, but it comes to me as I compile the images. Or perhaps there's something that has really inspired me that I'm specifically looking to discuss, and I'm searching and composing images based on that. So before I ever touch pen to paper, I have already worked out what I want. No mysteries, no surprises. I've composed it, and any edits that I'm making are quite minor. They probably deal with, like, the density of color, or just minor things, maybe a small aesthetic part of it. And so the piece that I have made on Photoshop then becomes the drawing reference. So that really exists nowhere beyond my own iPad. And I do want to say, I meant to say it at top, if you have questions, feel free to drop them in. I'm sure we'll have questions at the end, but if there's something you're dying to know off the cuff, type it in the chat, I guess. And so from there, I am starting to work. And what I draw inspiration from, and maybe it's a good time to get ready to switch over to sharing my screen. And let's see if I can do this in a way that is streamlined. Aha, here we go. And this is just some of the pieces, and some of them are actually behind me still, that I made in 2021, maybe slightly before that, but Carlos saw all of this in action. So it's just really cool the way like time plugs back in and we're here talking about it again together. But the work that I make deals heavily with social media, sort of the internet and culture broadly, like culture past, culture present, and it has now started moving into the realm of some of being inspired by some of the things that I really love to read about. And that sort of questions of physics, what's the nature of reality? And I don't want to say that and give you the impression I can tell you anything about the mathematics. I can't, but I like sort of the mind bending aspect of thinking about how often when I'm reading about these things, I'm finding you sort of have to hold in mind two things, right? Where, and it's sort of the same in any way. Like I compare it to the reality that we all experience as a shared event or through digital media, how we're all sort of building this language and these spheres of influence, and how images can operate as symbols, and how perhaps we come together digitally to do different things. Like, let's say there's a tragic event and we're all in digital spaces, sort of, if you're not directly commenting or participating, that's not the best word maybe, but it's a word, you're still viewing it and it's mediated, and it sort of, is that real? How do we share in an experience in the same way that, if you're reading about sort of that famous physics experiment with photons of light, where if they're going through two slits cut in paper, an observation makes the difference of how that light, what it chooses, which slit it goes through, or whether it goes through both. And so is reality sort of our lived experience, or is reality sort of this thing that, I want to say it's unknowable, but, how do you question the structure of it? What is, these are like things that are even sometimes hard to put into very concise speaking points, but, there's sort of no such thing as like an objective experience of anything, whether that's literally, whether that's online, whether that's whatever. And so for me, these questions of how culture functions, past, present, or even future, and how that's relative to, subjectivity and, what's authentically true and real, what's something that, what do we take away from the things that we sort of hold in common that you could say are perhaps subjective, and then sort of how things function subjectively. And I'm always looking to, in my work, sort of mirror the, sterility, I would say, of the internet, where my pieces, I want them, like I said earlier, highly rendered, to be sterile, to sort of feel a little bit defiant of any medium. Carlos very aptly mentioned, like, he was sort of ready to pass them by thinking it's Photoshop. And I think, to me, I don't want anyone passing the work by, but that's what I'm looking for, this sort of outside of normative sort of art or internet experience, where you're like, what am I looking at? How is it built? What is it saying? And the surface of meaning is, I'm looking to pursue, aesthetic beauty, something that exists over like a collector's couch. But I'm also looking to create pieces where I'm talking about things, and I'll get into it a bit as we see individual pieces, where hopefully they're each full of maybe a story or an idea or experiences that we can all relate to where these sort of sterile, and they're often square images, which is always for me a callback to kind of how we frequently see things on social media feeds. I want them to feel digital, but to be real, again, towing that line of like, what is real? What is reality? Is it authentic? We recognize, you can kind of see in the corner there, like a CD disc, and that piece was about like space exploration and sort of how we sent the Voyager albums, those sort of records that were gold discs, and they're full of all these like greatest hits of humanity. We've got like Bird Song, and we've got Johnny Be Good, and we've got like Hello from the Children of Earth. But the sort of lived experience of being on Earth is really nothing about like symphonies and Johnny Be Good and Hello from the Children of Earth. It's not wrong, but maybe it's not accurate. But both are true. And so for me, that there's tension there that I really enjoy exploring. And so, often the work addresses maybe these ideas of, like I said, reality, but also maybe scenarios that are relative, what perhaps is an apocalypse. How do we define it? A lot of my work is inspired by reading. I've read many books, one of them like Dan Carlin's The End is Always Near, sort of that notion of like, the people in the Renaissance didn't know they were living, in this very intensely creative and flowering and fruitful time that lays the foundation for sort of how Western thought and art has continued. So, only in retrospect do we identify these things. And so all of that I find to be just so fascinating and equally relevant to time now as it is to time immemorial. And so that's the direction I'm coming from when I'm making my work. And so I'm going to, now I have 3 pieces that I've included of my most recent work that I just want to talk a bit about specifically, so you can get an idea of how those overarching ideas funnel down into, what I make piece by piece. And the next 2 pieces that I'll be showing you deal with, and I mentioned it just a bit ago, kind of the idea of like an apocalypse. And I'm sort of like tentatively, sometimes I'll have in mind like maybe a couple words or something I'm calling. It might not be a series, but it is like kind of the direction I want to go. So I'm sort of thinking of the idea of like soft apocalypse. And so it's kind of like, what is a worst case scenario? So some of the ones I'm working with are like Love and Betrayal, or Hard and Soft, that has sort of this silky fabric, and bullets around it. And this one is full of really lovely pastel, sort of hellacious, I hope cute kind of also imagery, where it's a crow or a raven, you know, this sort of, I don't know, they get a little bit of a bad rap maybe, but, you know, one of the things that I think is interesting about them is they're one of the ones in like the conversation of consciousness, or maybe intelligence is a better word. Like they're very smart birds, and they'll often do problem solving where, like, if they can get a treat out of a cup full of water, they'll drop things in to raise the water level to get it. But in the background also is sort of all of this iconography. There are little like stained glass Satans in the background that come from sometime in antiquity. Sometimes these images are credited that I use where it says it's from such and such church or such and such place. I don't know that was, so I don't know where that devil's coming from. But it is sometime in antiquity, we'll say. And so, you know, thinking about the notion of maybe like hell or apocalypse, but you know, I can't even attribute this quote. I know it's a comedian. I'm sure one of you can. You guys will probably be screaming it in your head, but like, you know, that thought of maybe like hell is other people, which I don't subscribe to. I think smile at the world and it smiles back. But, you know, it's like in the complexity of interfacing or in these cultural symbols, you know, I hope that this piece is something that pushes and pulls a bit on imagery that is a bit, what's the word that I'm looking for? Not disturbing, but, you know, sort of birds flocking, things burning, devils appearing, where, you know, these are all things that are made manifest anyway, in a multitude of ways or not. You know, is a worst case scenario always a worst case scenario, or do you even know? Kind of hearkening back to the example of like, you know, people of the Renaissance having they didn't call it the Renaissance. You know, could you be in your sort of most peaceful or best or luxuriant era, or is it the worst times? These things are never, they can only be sort of realized by looking back and being referential to the past. So, you know, that's sort of, oh, what's the title for this one? It's Pastel Hell. I just can't resist a rhyme. Also love the color pink. So this one is sent out now. It'll be exhibiting in Long Beach soon with another piece. But that was sort of the individual thought behind this work, which pairs to me with this one on the same path and trajectory. This one is called Infinite. And I just really was drawn first to these gloved hands, which just feels fancy anyway. You know, it's sort of like this signifier of like, you know, maybe a yield butler or magic or just fancy, you know, like a dust glove. So, you know, to me, this imagery was already quite a bit laden with those ideas. And I definitely like the aspect of them of sort of like magic or, you know, material, sort of in the sense of like, to do like a magic trick, sort of pulling a rabbit out of a hat or something like that. You know, these are associations that I have anyway with these images. But I'm thinking here about sort of the idea of infinity and sort of this, you know, the infinity symbol. I don't know if I can get my hands right. But that sort of infinite loop here, it's on its side. You know, I don't want it to be so obvious, but it's sort of like this, where it's like the gentle touch, but it's also that allusion to that, whether it's obvious or not. It's not super important, but I wanted it in there. And I'm thinking, you know, I'm reading these books, you know, lights, is it a particle? Is it a wave? It's both, sort of the nature of it. You know, the universe, where does it stop? What's its shape? We don't really know how, you know, the true nature of how gravity is interfacing with like quantum things versus, you know, your classical physics. And there's something, and when I was a kid, it would kind of keep me up at night thinking about time immemorial. I'd kind of be laying down for bed and be like, well, it's been a really long time before I was born, like billions of years, and I like have no conscious memory of it. And then one day I'll die and there'll be billions of years more. And I don't know where it stops and ends. And I don't know if this thought, I mean, I think it's terrifying, but I think there's, at least to my estimation, something very like, at least as I grow older, very comfortable with it, where I can acknowledge as I read, like, there's like that, is it Carl Sagan? He's like, we're all made of star stuff, which is quite glib, but it's also factual, to where I sort of assume we're birthed and returned into this mysterious space that in my lifetime, perhaps we'll know more of the nature of, maybe we won't. But foremost, for this idea, it's sort of like haunting and scary, but I also want it to be beautiful and mysterious, a certain level of transparency. You can see the bottom glove a bit has, or at least my intention is to make it a bit transparent, to where it's like, are these things manifested in, and maybe these are the questions of the things I'm reading as well, like the truth of them, is it what we sort of know to be true scientifically and cannot experience or witness, or is it the experience that we sort of manifest, that we know and live and have subjectively and collectively, right? But we can sort of only assume everyone else is not a robot. I forget what the hypothesis is, but there's one where it's like, you can only be certain of your own consciousness, but even then, maybe you can't. But anyway, that's a rabbit hole, but that's what I'm thinking, in this piece. And when I'm saying the broad term, soft apocalypse, I'm thinking of this the same way, like what could be worse, maybe worse is the wrong word, than non-existence. But I don't know. I've been in non-existence and nothing, I don't know it, and all this existence had to happen in sequence, and for all of us to be here today together. But there's this idea, it's like how the observer feeds into the system, how observation changes, how sort of the very small elements of reality form objective reality. So all of that is under consideration in this piece. And sometimes I work very hard to be concise about it, to my own estimation, at varying levels of success. But, this piece I'm particularly proud of because I feel as if I'm able to try to wrap my arms around something that is, you almost can't, this idea of infinite, but it's like, how can I put it into its simplest terms in a way that is objectively true to me and at minimum beautiful to everyone else? I hope people read what I'm writing, but if they don't, I hope it's just beautiful. So I have one more piece. Oh, that's a good question. So in a piece like this, thank you, what did I start with? I started with the background, and that is a great question because that's a technique question. I generally try to start, and I don't always do it because sometimes I'm really excited to draw one aspect or another. But as a right-handed person, I try to start in the top left corner, so I'm doing no smudging. And I try to start with my dark values first, because, and this gets into the rabbit hole, and I can't remember, Carlos, if we talked about this or not, about how yellow is the worst color, because it shows, and white is like this too, and there's a couple other colors, light pinks, but it shows everything, and it's a mess. If you do these white gloves very lovingly first, and then I'm doing all these like dark blacks and blues, the amount of dust that comes out of colored pencils is unbelievable, and it gets ground in. And once it gets ground in, like your only recourse really is taking an X-Acto knife and you're like scraping away at it, and it's just awful. So background first, dirt colors first usually is the way that I tend to go about it. But sometimes I'm too excited, and you can always like I'm doing it here. Well, not really. This is a commission piece, but I'll do like a mask around it where I might say there was more to this image, tape off a piece so that you're not working right on top of it. But yeah, generally speaking, dark value first. I finished the background, then I did the gloves. So I knew from the jump I was going to include the gloves. And I don't have my iPad up here. Otherwise, I'd show you that digital collage. So this was already, I mean, just imagine this, but a collage. And I don't collage as much as I used to in the analog and traditional sense. But I did always enjoy it. That was maybe the only other medium that I felt really drawn into. 11/11, everyone make a wish. Sorry, I looked down to make sure I'm not over talking my time, but so I think like subconsciously that's how it got into my process. I really enjoyed it because it was just a quick way of making artwork, or thinking like, oh, that's a great image, that's a cool image. I when you see, at least for me, everyone's brain's on a different wavelength, but I start to ruminate, like if I clip out that image, what does it mean? What can I do? Oh, that's so cool, but I hate that background. How can I manipulate it? Oh, good question, Carlos. So I assume everyone can read these, but I guess this will get recorded. And he says, I'm guessing you didn't collage the color spread on the lower hand. How did you decide on the colors affecting the glove? And so there I'm playing a bit with basically like the layers and the features of them. So and this is where I am able to make decisions on the fly. I maybe dropped the opacity of the glove, maybe used a couple layers, I couldn't even tell you. Sometimes I'm in there and I'm like, if I flatten these layers, I have no idea what I did. I can't go back. I don't know what I did. But when I'm drawing it, I can say, okay, I want to turn up the contrast a little bit. I want it a little darker here, or whatever the case may be. So suffice to say, the like collages that I do look a good deal like these works, but those are the minute choices I'm making where I'm like, like I want to get rid of this little part, or like, ooh, that needs to be brighter or darker or more deeply shaded, or in reality, I don't think it works so well, so I'm going to slightly edit out something. Those are the minor changes I do as I go.
So Sarah, just to clarify, when you say you start with the darks, you are starting in the composition on Photoshop with the darks, or are you starting with the colored pencils in the dark?
Great question. Colored pencil with the dark. On Photoshop, I'm almost positive I started with the gloves. I was like enamored, their shininess and their like just beauty. I don't know. In the image I got them out of, I think they were holding graham crackers or something. And I don't know what else was it. It was like just it was off it'll come to me. I don't want to waste time thinking of the website, but Unsplash. Also Carla says this piece reminds me of childbirth. That's fascinating. It wasn't, I don't want to say it's directly in my mind. I'm of a certain age where like I'm beginning to be like, okay, do I choose? I think that's something we discussed at length, Carlos, over our many times together. I know you're a parent. Like do I make that choice? Do I, how does it affect my career as an artist? Is that something it's something that I'm not closed off to, but it's something that I suppose I hold in mind often. So I don't know, these things where if you're seeing that in there, it's not wrong. I just, not directly, I would say, but it's really interesting that you say that. I'd like to actually hear more about that from you when we're offline. Another question is, do you sketch first or map out the image with a grid on paper? Great question, Lisa. Yes, both. It really is time dependent. If I can be very like luxuriant, which I love to do, I'm drawing it, from top to bottom. But I don't always, depending on deadlines, depending on scale of work, depending on what's going on, it's like, okay, you know, I can remember as a young artist, even now being like, oh, wow, they have assistants helping paint, or like, oh, how could they not draw it all out? And then when it's your career, you're like, I have no time. And if one part of this process goes, I guess it's like the part where you're just like sketching and you're erasing and you're fixing that line. So sometimes it does have to be a grid. Sometimes it's like you might even have to transfer the image. And sometimes the way I have to build them, the stakes are so high. I don't know if you can see it. You definitely can't see the detail, but around this image, there's actually very tiny lettering. And for the deep, dark background, it's paint marker, but you can't just be erasing it because it'll change the surface quality. It'll kind of buff it to where it's shiny and not matte. So it's like, I have one shot. That's it to get the lettering perfect. And so it's like, after I've drawn that whole thing and the last step is lettering, I do not want to be erasing, drawing, sketching. So I transfer that. I will say I have very tidy handwriting, but even myself, I would not even, I dare not try. I don't want to mess it up at like the 11th hour. How big is this? This piece is 10 by 10. These are 15 by 15. I'd say like that 10 by 10 to 15 by 15 is my sweet spot. This piece is 16 by 20. And this is one that I created for the Complex Art Fair, or Context, I'm sorry. I always say Complex because of the magazine Context, down in Miami with Harmon Projects. And this piece was, and I talked a bit earlier about being fascinated by culture, sort of old and new. This one is a spin on the myth of Leda and the Swan. And so for me, it's sort of that culture and sort of taking this myth that sort of features, you know, it's really quite violent, like Zeus is busy raping everybody, honestly, back in all of the old myths. But it's always sort of realized in these classical paintings as this very, you know, they're always quite beautiful and they're quite, it's a light touch, right? There's never anything very violent about them. So I'm taking that and sort of like, it's a nod to these images where there's not this like agency of Leda, and here she's a mannequin. And where, you know, it's sort of like both beautiful and a bit violent gesturing of the wings, and sort of this floral background, which is from an old like Dutch painting, where these arrangements speak very much to like these domestic scenes, and you sort of have these still lifes in this tradition of like interior painting, and, you know, flowers sort of being symbolic and representing all of these things. And so I wanted it to be a bit of a like distortion, like it almost exists in this liminal space that I hope is a visual ode to that art historical tradition, but the idea of like how the power exists and the agency in the story, or depictions of this female, and sort of the idea of this like reductive thing, or this classical myth, or feminine beauty, or, you know, being, you know, so beautiful and so irresistible that you've wrought this like this Zeus couldn't possibly like resist, have any sort of agency of his own action. So that's what this piece, so this one's a bit unique in that it's addressing this myth and idea in a very specific way, but I still think of it in the same sense of this idea of like apocalyptic idea, or, you know, just existing in my subjective experience as a woman, as a person who reflects on these myths, who exists in a world that's sort of built on this tradition and ideas, and where these things don't ever die, and nor should they, but, you know, this line of like past to present, and sort of these stories, and how it ties into the lived experience, and then maybe how can I take that context and put it into a different or more liminal space, or in an outside of reality format. And I have a question here. What kind of colored pencils do I use? And is each color a separate pencil, or can you blend? I am a Prismacolor stan. I'm Prismacolor pilled. They're so buttery. I've tried like the Derwents and all the other brands, but they're just like too crunchy and hard. They don't, and that's like to every artist their own hand, right? Like people aren't gonna like what I like and vice versa, but they blend so smoothly, so buttery. It's just like chef's kiss. And there's a lot of techniques. I do teach a class at Capitol Hill Arts Workshop dealing with colored pencil. And we talk a bit about like there are different techniques. You can use solvents to blend. There's blender color pencils. But really for me, I don't know. I don't like them. It sort of changes their surface quality. The solvents make it so that you sort of can't rework into it. So often I'm blending, and it's so hard to talk about these things without like showing you, but often I'm starting with a darker, let's say I start with this green, maybe I go over top of it with a lighter green, and I'm pressing so that it's very smooth. I don't, for my own work, you know, colored pencil sort of classically has a bit of that paper texture with it. It can look a bit grainy, and I don't want that in my work. So I'm using a lot of pressure and blending and working over and over it to really have it have a very smooth, cohesive surface. So yes, yeah, a nod to Renaissance artist iconography. Absolutely. I'm such a fan of all of that, of course. Like no artist grows up and isn't like looking at, you know, the Sistine Chapel and all of that and seeing how it has laid the groundwork for what you're doing now. And what type of paper I use? Great question. I use Stonehenge paper. That's another one that I'm like, it's a non-negotiable. I've tried others, and not all paper holds colored pencil the same. I actually just started a piece and I realized it was not on Stonehenge because it wasn't handling right. So I like threw it out and had to start over. I don't know. I must have saved something, and I was like, what? I can't use this. But I usually buy, this is just a board that's really dirty because I use it to rest my hand on when I'm drawing. But I use a birch panel, and I adhere the paper to the panel. And I generally use, if it's small, I'll use a spray mount. If it's not, I'll use a gel matte medium. And my husband is my intern all the time for this stuff because it's a two-hand job. And basically just kind of lay it down, use a like a printmaker's roller, brayer? No, maybe. All right, nice. I'm seeing some head nods, throwing out random art words, but to get it adhered, and then I'm like smashing it down under all the beans in our household so it sets overnight. So that's my highly sophisticated artistic process, collecting all the heavy stuff to really press it. Yeah, so we're at 11:24, and hopefully that sort of encapsulates everything about the work generally, and some of the pieces I'm doing to give you an idea of the trajectory I'm on. And I don't know, I guess I open it up if there's any questions or thoughts, or otherwise I'm happy to address them. And I'm going to bounce back if I can, and show, and I'm going to hand over my screen sharing. It's like the first time every time I do this. Pause share and stop my share. Aha, okay. We're back in the chat.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Well, I have a question. I think what listening to you talk was phenomenal, and I definitely have a new appreciation for the amount of work that goes into something like this. I think we're coming from a standpoint of a more, I don't know, quick artist. If I don't get a painting done in like 2.5 hours, then I'm not, it's like, oh, I'm not going to pay them all anymore. So
oh my God, yeah.
So
Kudos
it's
to you.
much different mentality, I think, for most people. I don't think this is a very common approach to making art. You know, maybe like VJ Simmons or something like that would be more in your wheelhouse, where it's kind of about the labor and the process. But what comes to my mind, hearing you talk, was, you know, we're in an age where AI is the new thing, and the amount of work it takes a computer to come up with an image or find an answer that you Google or whatever is so immediate,
Mhm.
and it feels almost like you're slowing down the computer in a way. You know, like an image can be created really quickly in Photoshop or whatever, and it takes seconds. But then you're saying, well, let's prolong that and kind of turn this into a longer, kind of more methodical, more thought out kind of process. So it's almost like you're reversing a computer's thought. Does that make
Mhm.
sense?
Yes.
Am I getting on the right path?
Yeah, absolutely. That's beautiful, honestly. Yeah.
You know, what does that mean to you? Because like typically I'd say, you know, when you are selling artwork, you're sharing your vision, right?
Yeah.
Like, so when I make a painting, I'm saying, here's my point of view. It's different from any other point of view. And this is the same thing with photography. Like if you are a photographer and you take a snapshot, you are collaborating with the camera as the photographer. So it's your point of view through the lens of a camera of reality. And you're kind of taking it even almost a step further. You're going from old master, we'll call it, through a computer to the human. You're almost reversing the process in a way. Is that kind of your goal in a way, is to kind of
Yeah.
change what is the dynamic relationship from an art to an artist and the tools, machines, and so forth?
No, it's a really good thought, and I want to be in conversation with these things, and I want to sort of remediate them, and I don't necessarily like, it doesn't have to always be literal or sort of, what's the word I'm looking for, where linear. It doesn't have to be linear, like in the way that I think you could say, like, is time linear? Is like time objectively real? We can, and I mentioned earlier, sort of having to look back to be definitive. You know, I don't want these things necessarily to exist in sequential time, but sort of to answer the question of how we interface with all of it, right? So I want it to hold in mind simultaneously the past, the evolving present, sort of going in, out, around, and through all of these ways we access image or art or history or time. You know, we'll only ever know the past or even the future or what's going on now, likely like via this. You know, like when I'm like, oh shoot, what museum can I go see, you know, David at? And I can't think of it. Like my only experience of it until I go there is Googling like, what museum has David? And so I see at least my artistic and life process is so convoluted in between, sort of like, you know, on paper, it's like, why would you even care about something that's made in the 15th century? I assume 16th century. Don't quote me. When was David sculpted? I don't know. I'll Google it. But, you know, as much as it's like, and then my conduit to that time, that era, is digital. And then in September, I'm literally going there and I'm going to go see it. So I think of my work as it's answering that same question or idea.
And I understand now what you mean by liminal. I had to look it up to remind myself of the meaning, and it's a transitional space, and it's sort of one created by computer also. I mean, it applies. And so I love particularly the first piece you showed us that has the borders. I was thinking about the sort of aesthetic of adding the borders and the white borders, and I was thinking, well, a collage artist would cut them off, but you wanted to express that those sort of overlap or shuffle with each other. And so I think that's, and so that's in a way making present what the liminal part of your aesthetic is.
Thank you.
It is wonderful.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. I don't know, questions from anyone else?
One more. This kind of, I was showing that context as well, and as touring the fair itself, it is a chaotic zoo where
I can only imagine.
be included, can very easily get lost in the crowd. And thinking about what Carlos said earlier about how, you know, at first glance he thought it was digital, created in Photoshop or whatever. How do you kind of counteract the getting lost in the noise?
Yeah, and I think about that a lot, and I think in general a lot, right? Like how your artwork is perceived anyway, right? And as an artist, and I'm speaking with like the royal we here, like that's the part we have the absolute least control over. There's almost nothing I can do about how the gallery chooses to then curate it, where on the wall it goes, what it's next to, what context, no pun intended, that it might be in. And then what people take away from it, you know, like I think all the time of these choices that I make where I look at a piece or I listen to music and, you know, I think like, you know, it's just not for me. I don't get it. And I know people do that all the time with my work or others' work. It's nothing that I can do. I only can hope that someone looks at it and just says like, oh, what is that? Like, I really like it. But that's all my recourse in that. You know, I could scream from the mountaintops and I can buy ads on Instagram and I can say, you know, I so believe in this work. It's just me on the wall hanging there. I poured my my essence, my everything into it. But someone still might look at it and be like, it's dumb. But what, you know, and it's like, and sometimes they do. And so you have to like, part of, I think the consternation of being an artist is just sitting with that and being like, wow, you might as well have like put a knife in my heart, but that's okay. You can't do anything about that. So it's like, it's one of those factors that you can't invest a ton of time in because it's wildly outside of my realm of control.
Totally.
Yeah.
Yep, I feel the same way.
Yeah.
Awesome.
You know, I assume people don't lose sleep over me making those choices. So I cannot do the same. I can't be losing sleep.
I think I wandered the fair thinking the amount of time that people are looking at the work as they're wandering versus the amount of time it took that artist, and I know time is relative to you, but like the amount of time it took that artist to create even a square inch of surface like yours. And I think that just, I get it, but it's just like, it's like pay attention. But even myself, as I wander, kind of just like see where my attention goes. I think that's the same as like scrolling through a phone. It's like, where does my attention go? What do I stop on? And I think that's something that artists it's like the cross we have to bear in a way.
Sure. Yeah, you all you can do is what you do. And then it's really, and I've actually never been to like a proper art fair.
Don't go.
You have to imagine, like, I don't even know, is it about the art or is it about the spectacle? Like art has so few things where it's like, I don't want to equate, you know, Art Basel with like the Oscars, but I mean, the Oscars, it's about being awarded, and obviously you want that on your resume and you want to go to context or you want to go to Basel, but it's sort of, I think, equally about seeing and being seen and sort of this party and you know, to an extent, like sort of the cosplaying of sort of being in this certain level of culture, right? In the same way there's like complex con and there's other things that are equivalent where it's not really like what's actually happening there. It's like just a big party. So, you know, you kind of wonder, it's like, what is, and maybe that's the question of all of it, like, what is it really?
I guess that's what being vulnerable is.
Yeah, yeah. It's like the most chaotic and vulnerable experience. You just really hope someone puts it on their stories and tags you. That's
I don't
the big
remember what
hope
book
of
I was
life.
reading, but it was an artist who had work at Sotheby's being sold, and he sold it originally for like, you know, $10,000.
Yeah.
He was in the crowd watching his piece being sold for millions of dollars, and him not knowing that he's alive and getting none of that money. And it was just like, that was the worst experience I've ever dealt with. And it's just, you know, that's kind of what it felt like at the art
Yeah.
place. It's like you're watching the side of the process of art creating it is just not what you had envisioned, like
Right.
your job to be part, you know.
Yeah, we could do a whole hour plus on like the art world. I feel like, and I see some other artists on here too, and I'm like, gosh, we could all. I'm like, microphones on, let's get deep.
Yeah,
But,
right.
We could definitely do that another day. That
Yeah.
artists ranting about the bad side of the art world.
Yeah.
For more than an hour.
Right. And I'm like, all that said, I would love for someone to like, you know, use an art piece of mine in an offshore account for tax fraud. I would feel like I'd really made it if that happened for me, but
Yes.
yeah.
Sarah,
Yes.
Sarah, I see some beautiful framed art behind
Yes.
you that has some of the imagery that you showed us. So do you redo it again when you are doing, for example, the overlapping piece? I see a couple of the images by themselves. So what do you do? Do you actually paint or recolored pencil to include those images?
These are well, some of this is just random inspiration stuff. My
Right.
husband drew himself a swamp thing, like niece's art and stuff. But so these you saw in the beginning on that sort of just like landing page with the borders, and a local framer, I'll shout her out, frame master Meredith, framed those beautifully for an exhibition at La Luz de Jesus. And that was, you know, I go back and forth, like, because I think colored pencil is a bit atypical in like, how do you present it? And I was actually speaking with the curator at the gallery talking about like colored pencil art. And it was his hot tip to start using the birch panel. You know, I think, and this sort of plugs into the idea of like perception, reality, all that, but he was kind of like, there's something about the birch panels, and I find this to be true now that I've done both, that changes the perception of the art, where people respond to it differently versus when it's in a frame than when it's presented a bit more like a painting. So I have found that to be true, where since I've made the switch, there is a difference for whatever reason. It's that perception reality thing where on birch panel, it sort of, it hits different, as the kids.
Yeah, it's a glass that sort of is a barrier a little bit. Yeah.
And it feels maybe stuffy and stodgy. I don't want to talk down on my own work, but I sort of landed on that as the thing. Yeah, it's the glass. It's the glass.
It's unfortunately, I used to be a watercolor, so I really appreciate. Right, and so, exactly. Do you varnish the? Do you varnish the?
Yeah,
isn't as well received, unfortunately. Yes. It's really terrible, but it's true.
Yeah. And a wonderful comment from another amazing fellow artist, Anya. Art behind glass isn't as well received, unfortunately, while the panel is perceived as an object. And I think that's it.
Right.
Yeah. That's like, wow, concisely said, beautifully said.
So what do you use for varnish? Do you varnish?
I use, so I'm doing the thing where like you're nice from the waist up. I won't show you guys my pajamas pants, but It's a spray varnish. And
Okay.
for artists like myself who work with mixed medium, you have to be a bit careful because the varnish can act as a solvent. So I use Golden Brand Satin Archival Varnish Spray. Yeah, to protect it.
Thank you.
Yes.
That's great. And lots of accolades. Thank you from people just in the chat saying thank you for presenting your
Sure.
process
And I so
and your
appreciate
series. This was
everyone
amazing.
coming, chatting.
Can we visit your studio sometime?
Oh, I would
Yeah.
love that. It's in my house, so you'd have to like pet my dog, but yes, all are welcome.
We would have to write to you
Yes.
first and
Yep. Just shoot me an email and I would love to have.
on one of these devices.
Yes, use your phone and
The
email.
liminal space.
Yes, do it digitally so we can meet in person. Yeah.
Wonderful.
Thank you again, Amanda. I just want to remind everybody, in 2 weeks we have, or sorry, Sarah.
Oh,
In
good.
2 weeks we have Amanda. That's what I was trying to remind myself.
No, it's perfect. I've been answering to
I'm
Amanda
backwards.
lately, weirdly. Yeah.
Thank you, Sarah. I want to remind everyone we have Amanda Huron Murphy coming in 2 weeks. She is in charge of the curator, resident programs, and collector programs at MoCA Arlington. So she'll talk a little bit about what it is I think she's an artist as well, but I think she's going to talk more about the Arlington programs and what is happening at MoCA Arlington. So a little bit change of pace next week, and then back to more artists.
Thank you so much. This was wonderful.
Thank you
Sarah
guys. It's
and
been my
Carlos.
pleasure, and I so appreciate everyone, giving me the opportunity and then coming to listen to me speak on
Thanks
the
to
work.
Carlos for inviting us.
Yes, Carlos is the
Thank you
MVP.
so much. The MVP,
We have a couple
right?
more of Carlos's artists. I'm gonna group you guys as Carlos's artists.
Yeah, please do. We'll take that. I speak for
this is
everyone.
right.
All right. Thanks,
Have
everyone.
a wonderful day.
Thank you guys very
everyone.
much.
Thank you.
Take care.